Time to start work on the peplum. First off, we need to fold in the facings. Grab piece 9, which you previously interfaced with a small rectangle, and fold the interfacing back on the wrong side of the fabric. We now sew over the top of the facing at 1 cm from the top edge to keep it in place. You may also need to sew an easing stitch on this piece for later. Use the same sewing machine settings as you used for sewing the easing stitch on the armhole of the sleeve. Before we sew the peplum together, we need to mark out the pleat markings on piece 10. Pin the pattern to the right side of the fabric. Pin beside each of the markings for the pleats. These are the solid vertical lines. Pull out all the extra pins which aren't next to the pleat markings. Fold back the pattern piece along the pleat marking and chalk out a line next to it. Mark out each of the pleat markings onto the fabric with tailor's chalk. Also, mark the arrows to tell you which direction the pleats must face. All the pleats on this jacket must face towards the centre back. Grab both of piece 10 and pin them together along the side with the triple notch. Sew these pieces together with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Finish the seams that you've done so far for the peplum. Keep in mind that the peplum isn't lined, so you need to make a pretty finish by folding the seam allowance in half and sewing along the fold. Cut the excess seam allowance off. Now we can start making the pleats. We start pleating from the corner to the center of piece 10. Fold the fabric along the pleat marking at the base of the arrow and pin. Place the fold that you just made on top of the pleat marking at the head of the arrow. The pleats at the center need to be placed together over the seam line. Change your sewing machine to the long straight stitch. We now sew straight down the pleat next to the fold to hold it in place. Pull pull out some of the thread from the machine before and after you sew this temporary seam, and don't backstitch. Sew over the top edge of the pleats at 1 centimeter. Place both of piece 9 on top of piece 10 with right sides together at the side seam. You need to match the side with the notches and sew with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Finish the rest of the seams for the peplum by folding the seam allowance in half and sewing along the top. Lay the peplum on top of the main body of the jacket with right sides together. Start by aligning the centre back at 1.5 centimeters. Then align the matching side seams together too. Sew over these seams at 1.5 centimeters to check their alignment. Pin the rest of the peplum. The end of the peplum should be pinned 1.5 centimeters away from the end of the waistline. We do this so that we can fold back the seam at this corner later. You can use the easing stitch that you sewed at the top of piece 9 to help you place the peplum nicely at the end. Sew the peplum onto the jacket with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Finish the seam with a zigzag stitch. Carefully use your scissors to pull out the temporary stitches holding the pleats into place. Finish the lower edge of the lining. The lining needs to be hand sewn onto the seam at the waist for the best look. Pin up the seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters at the wrong side of the bottom edge of the lining. Fold the lining down on top of the seam allowance for the waist. Arrange the lining so that the fold covers the seam for the waist and also try to align the side seams. At the end of the facing, fold the corner so that the seam allowance is tucked inside and looks neat. And pin into place. Thread your needle double. We need to start sewing at the center front seam where you left a space at the end. Knot your thread into the seam allowance. I'm using a ladder stitch to sew the lining down, and here's how to do it. Make a horizontal stitch across the seam. Now we start the ladder stitch on the opposite side. You need to push your needle into the fold of the fabric for about half a centimeter, then pull through. Move to the other side of the seam. You need to make a stitch which starts parallel to where the last stitch ended. Keep sewing until you reach the corner. Now you need to sew the lining along the waistline. You need to use the ladder stitch again. Stitch into the fold of the lining. Next, push the needle into the seam allowance of the waistline. Check the right side of the jacket to make sure that the needle isn't showing, then pull the needle through. Try to make the stitch as close as possible to the seam. Keep stitching along the waist and up the side of the lining, then knot off. Finish the lower edge of the peplum. Fold up the edge by 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch and pin and iron down. You will also need to fold up 2.5 centimeters for the facing at the end of the peplum. Create a nice smooth edge and corner while doing this. Turn the jacket to the front. Try and smooth out the hem to create a nice even look around the pleats. Sew around the bottom edge of the peplum with a seam allowance of about 5 millimeters. This doesn't fold away the raw edge of the hem, so we also need to do an invisible hemming stitch on the peplum. Fold under the raw edge of the hem by 5 millimeters and pin. Here's how to do a blind hemming stitch. Firstly, we thread our needle and push it into the seam allowance of the fabric. The first stitch we make is by running the needle through the fold of the hem. You shouldn't be able to see the needle. Pull the needle through. The next stitch is made on the wrong side of the peplum. With your needle, pick up just a few threads of the fabric very close to the end of the last stitch. Run the needle through the fold of the hem again, entering the fabric very close to where you made the stitch on the peplum. Keep doing this all the way around the peplum. Knot off your thread when you reach the other end of the facing. You now have an invisible hem which can barely be seen on either side of the jacket. On the pattern pieces for piece 1 and 9, you will need to draw a line 1.5 centimeters away from the edges, on the sides closest to the buttonhole markings. For piece 9, you need to mark the center front instead of the seam allowance. Also, mark 1.5 centimeters away from the top edge. Now we'll pin both of these pattern pieces to the left side of the jacket. Place the pattern pieces so that the line marking that you made is directly on top of the right edge and the waistline. Trace the markings for the buttonholes by folding the pattern back and chalking the marking beside it onto the fabric. Set up your sewing machine to do a buttonhole. Most modern machines are automatic, but have a good read of your instruction manual. For most machines, you will need to follow these steps. Load the buttonhole foot onto your machine. If you are using a spherical button like me, allow a little extra space on the buttonhole foot, and press down the tab on the machine which guides the foot. Change your machine to the buttonhole mode and lower the stitch length to about 1. Remember that after each buttonhole you need to switch the buttonhole mode off then on again to restart the sequence. Test how well the buttonhole works with some scrap fabric. Grab your jacket. Place the buttonhole foot so that the needle is facing the edge of the fabric. The marking for the end of the buttonhole must be inside the space for the needle, with the markings aligned directly with the middle. Start sewing that buttonhole. When you're done, we'll split open the buttonhole with a quick unpick. Slide a pin across one end of the buttonhole. On the opposite side, push the unpick into the space between the stitching and rip the fabric until you reach the pin. Try your best not to rip the stitching. Now we need to sew the button on the other side of the jacket. Once again, pin pattern pieces 1 and 9 to the right side, but this time mark the cross in the middle of the buttonholes. This is the buttonhole marking. To sew in the button, I'm using a double-threaded needle. push the needle through the lining side of the jacket so that it comes out through the marking that you made. Thread the button through the needle and push the needle back into the right side of the fabric to make a loop. Keep repeating this process until the button is firmly held into place, then not off. Before we sew the tab, I'm going to mark out the placement of the buttonholes on the tab by referring back to the pattern piece. Mark out a space at the center where you will pull the tab right side out. Place the two tab pieces right sides together and pin. Sew all around the tab, but don't sew between the markings that you just made. Trim the seam allowance to about half and cut small triangles into the seam allowance, but make sure you don't cut the stitching. Finish the seam. Pull the tab right side out and iron flat. We need to close up the space left in the tab. Fold under the raw edge and hand sew it shut. I'm using a ladder stitch, which I previously showed you how to do when sewing the lining down. Set up your sewing machine to do buttonholes once again and work the buttonholes into the tab. Fold the tab in half to find the center and make a marking. Place the tab on top of the jacket so that the center marking that you just made aligns with the center back seam of the jacket. Arrange the tab over the waist seam as you like and pin. Use the same method to sew the buttons onto the tab as for the front opening of the jacket. Here's the finishing touches I suggest to keep your jacket looking top notch. We need to hem and bring the lining into the sleeves. Fold up the bottom edge of the sleeve by 4 cm on the inside and pin. Grab the lining for the sleeve and slip it inside so that the wrong sides are facing together. Make sure that the seams are together and the lining isn't twisted. Pull the lining further down than the sleeve, then fold up the raw edge of the lining by 1.5 cm on the outside. Push the lining back into the sleeve and place the fold of the lining against the fabric. The lining needs to be placed so that the fold of the lining is about 1.5 cm away from the fold for the fabric. On the inside, the raw edges should be close together. We now hand sew the lining down using an invisible ladder stitch. This is the same stitch we used for sewing the lining down on the waist, so refer to that part of the video. As you sew, make sure that the needle isn't piercing the right side of the fabric for the sleeve. Hem both of the sleeves. To hold the collar together, I suggest slip stitching the 2 layers. Start sewing at the notch. Push your needle into the fabric so that it passes through the fabric of piece 8 and catches the seam allowance of piece 4. You shouldn't be able to see the needle on the right side of piece 4 as you sew. Make another stitch by piercing the fabric just a few millimeters from where the thread last came out. Make small straight stitches all the way along the collar. This creates a neat and professional look for the jacket. Thanks for following along this video. Today we've learned how to sew a jacket. We've learned how to sew the body of the jacket, sew in the sleeves, and how to make a pleated peplum. This was a challenging project, but you did it! Next up in my pattern tutorial series, I'll be showing you how to make a ladylike wool coat for winter. We'll be putting some of the same techniques learnt in this video into practice.